Our three readings really today, are about choices. The fishermen that Jesus spoke to had choices to make. To us, what seems like hard choices to make. Andrew and Simon immediately left their nets and followed him. James and John did the same. They gave up their livelihood to follow this man walking along the shore. Would you have done that? Has Jesus called you to do the equivalent? Perhaps he did many years ago. Perhaps he's called and you haven't heard him and you haven't chosen to follow him. He still does call people like that. Very rarely do we hear of people who directly hear Jesus calling them, but it does happen. A friend of mine, Chris, who I met at Kempston East Methodist Church in the 1980s, was called to be a missionary in Russia as a result of going there on holiday. In fact, that was probably a turning point in both our lives. I remember Chris coming up to me after church one Sunday when I was just 20 and asking if I would go with him on a 17-day bus tour of Eastern Europe. Doesn't sound overly appetizing, does it? I could easily have said no, but I didn't. I certainly didn't feel at the time I was being called by God to go. But looking back on the consequences of the trip and therefore the consequences of that conversation after church that Sunday morning, my life and Chris's could have been completely different. As I said, Chris went on to become a missionary for 10 years, and while working in Russia, he met his future wife. And I met my future wife on that same trip, from which came our children and our life in Harlington, and ultimately me recording this today. 4 other people met their future spouse on that trip as well. It was quite an amazing Oak Hall holiday. In normal times, you would have recently taken part in the annual covenant service, at which you will have reaffirmed your commitment to God and your willingness to do what he asks. God doesn't take away our free will. Jesus didn't cast a spell over Andrew and Simon and James and John to make them follow him. It was their choice. Sometimes when we say no to God or ignore God, God is persistent and even insistent, like in Jonah's case. God clearly called Jonah to a very specific task, which Jonah, not unreasonably from a human point of view, did not want to do. He was called to witness to the hated Ninevites, part of the Assyrian people who had wiped out 10 of the tribes of Israel. The Jewish people of the time had a view that God was the God of Israel. He created the world, but they seemed to feel that he was restricted to the land of Israel. For example, he could only properly be worshipped at the temple in Jerusalem. So Jonah decided that he would make a run for it. He would sail away to pretty much the other side of the known world, completely the opposite direction. As we know very well, God didn't approve of Jonah's choice and sent the storm. Jonah realized what was happening and did the very noble thing of sacrificing his own life to save those of the ship's crew. But God had other ideas. So God rescued Jonah and gave him another chance to do God's will. That second time, he made the right choice and headed off to Nineveh. Life is all about choices. In many ways, in this country and in much of the world, we have more choice than ever before. The trick is to make the right ones. As Christians, of course, the right ones are always the ones God wants us to make. God wants the best for us. We just need to listen and choose. And we're going to continue with our worship by singing the hymn number 663 from Singing the Faith. A hymn by Daniel Shute. I, the Lord of sea and sky, I have heard my people cry. All who dwell in dark and sin, my hand will save.